when COVID came, a lot of people were hoping that that could be a shared enemy for the whole world. It could unite the world. A virus is almost like an alien invader, right? That it isn't a human, it isn't even like us. We're all threatened by it. Can we all unite together to share scientific info and production of medical supplies and those types of things? I remember that was like a very naive hope that a number of people were suggesting at the very beginning of COVID that might come from this, and I think we've seen almost as far from that as we can see. We've seen polarization on how to handle it in almost every country and between countries, and on almost every subtopic, whether it's hydroxychloroquine or masks or shutdown or vaccines. There's kind of polarization across the whole space. We've seen the entire global order has already shifted. Right? US-China relations were already tense, but they got very magnified in this situation. The tensions in the EU got very magnified. The relationships between the EU and Eastern Europe, those tensions got magnified. So I think COVID was just a big enough issue to start to set off the systemic fragilities that were already in place. So yeah, I think we were sitting right here having this conversation, I don't know, a year ago or something, before COVID, and we were talking about the breakdown in sense making that was already occurring, making it increasing the speed at which systemic fragility was being actuated and at which catastrophic risk was impending. But then since COVID, and then since the riots and the fires and the so many types of dynamics, increased militarized tension in various parts of the world, I think everyone feels quite differently about it. They have a sense of not just that some people are saying there might be impending catastrophe, but that we're in the process of that, and that it's not just within one area, it's cascading. And so what I want to talk about here today is not just, okay, there's all these problems, but why is our assessment of the problems one of the main causes of the problems themselves and the worsening of the problems? I mean, what would it take for us to have a kind of shared assessment that makes solutions possible at all? If we take almost any issue and say, what are the most consequential issues facing the world today? What are the things that are both hottest in the news cycle and possibly most consequential? And we start to list them, and we say, which of those is there fairly good consensus across the space of citizens on? It's like almost nothing, right? And not only is there not consensus, but there is nearly maximum polarization that is felt to be nearly maximally consequential, which is a basis for not just social tension, but a movement towards warfare. If you think about the upcoming US elections right now, I would say that we're in a situation that is unprecedented in the history of all of our lifetimes, and pretty much unprecedented in the history of the nation. Is everyone has always felt that presidential elections are consequential. Maybe they've even felt that they're more consequential than they really are. And they get passionate about it. But right now, the percentage of the population that thinks that it's not just consequential, this election, but is existential to the republic itself, is very high. Like, it's a very high percentage of the population that think the way this election goes will be either the end of the nation or the possibility of it to continue on both sides, right? So like, to really get a sense, the Trump supporters feel that Trump is the only thing standing between the republic being protected and the people being protected at all, and a kind of globalist deep state cabal taking everything over in a finalizing way and running the benign China hypothesis like they did in DC since the 70s, and basically ceding control of the world to China and that kind of thing. The never-Trumpers think that if Trump gets in, he will eviscerate the last elements of a republic and create a dynasty kind of for his family and chosen people to run it. Like, they both think that it's the end of the republic if the other guy gets in. And they both think the other side is going to steal it. They're set up to actually think that there isn't election security and it's going to be stolen. So what happens when the election comes? And it's not held as valid, and it's held as existential. And we have these mounting tensions already that were there with COVID because of lockdown. Lockdown means more news cycle to take all this stuff in, right? And then also it means radically increasing unemployment. And so when we saw the violence start with George Floyd, violence was actually bound to start from some trigger. When you study kind of the societal chaos indices, the things that would create a basis for societal chaos, the more people whose fundamental needs aren't met by a system, they become more desperately willing to act against the system. And so when you start having massive unemployment, that's a very unstable situation for the overall system, and that's going to express itself somehow. And no one really has the ability to process any of this well, nor is the reporting oriented to try to process it in an adequate way, which is actually a really hard thing to do. There's a much higher incentive to control a narrative for particular purposes. And so for the most part, people have kind of traded epistemology for tribalism, meaning given up on trying to do a rigorous job of making sense of things themselves. Like take a narrative, take a QAnon narrative, take a Antifa narrative, break it into individual propositions, and then look at each of those propositions. What evidence do I have to verify it or falsify it? Maybe neither. Do I have any evidence that would at least support or refute it? Do other people interpret that evidence differently? Go across the whole thing, then look at alternate hypotheses. Nobody does that, right? Like very, very few people use formal epistemic process. So what they're really doing is paying attention to what feels true, which largely has to do with what people like me kind of seem to think and which team I kind of want to be on and what I'm getting exposed to the most.